I always tell you the same thing, at least try to, the gratitude. I don't take this time for granted. I'm always grateful for the opportunity to be with you here. And I hope that some of you who, maybe when you started coming to the church, it was, got to go to church because of a sense of whatever, finally are coming to the sense of it's an hour or two at best of time well spent learning about God's Word with God's people in what I call perfect fellowship, which is everybody keeps their mouth shut. Pastor said a funny thing today in church. But what I want to say is, the gratitude that I have that there are those people who God is bringing who wish to hear the Word of God. We live in a very strange time where people have put an idea of what the church is supposed to be and what it's supposed to do. If you were listening on Festival, that's exactly what I was talking about. I think I've been talking about it since I took the pulpit. Dr. Scott talked about it and fought against it. It's a never-ending battle against the world ideology and encroachment of ideas of what we ought to be doing. But if you're going to call yourself a Christian, the most important thing is to be a follower of Christ. And the commission to the disciples at the close of Matthew's gospel is, go ye into all the nations, making disciples, learners of all things whatsoever I've commanded you, teaching them these commands, if you will. And the whole book, Old and New, is unwrapped in the flesh, if you will, when we encounter Christ. So if you're not willing to spend the time here to learn about God and His Word, save yourself the trouble. There are a lot better things you can do with your time if you're going to say you're a Christian, but you won't devote the time to studying, because this is the idea that is peddled everywhere. Church is an entertainment place. You got a good rock band, you got a good light show, you got some fans blowing, and maybe some people will fall over, and you'll leave feeling like you've been captured and manipulated by the Spirit. And it may be a spirit, but it sure is not the Spirit of God. That much I can say. When the Spirit of God takes hold of God's people, there's order. I'm not telling you that, everybody sits there like a robot either, but there's order. God does things in an orderly way. And He opens the mind to receive His Word, not the good thoughts and the positive thinking. There's nothing wrong with that, but when you come into the church, we're going to learn about God's people, God's way, God's Word. All right. In the previous messages, I've pointed out that God called a man out of Ur of Chaldees named Abram. And to Abram was given many promises, land and seed, that would come from the seed from his loin. He would become father of many through the natural process, but somewhat miraculous, but natural process of he and his aged wife. And through that line, which produces Isaac, we then go on to the children of Isaac, or at least the child who will become Jacob, known later as Israel, as his name is changed from heel catcher, conniver, deceiver, Jacob to Israel. And it is Jacob, I'm doing this deliberately, / Israel, his sons that we have been looking at, and his sons birthed out of 2 sisters and the handmaids of each sister, Leah and Rachel, and their handmaids. The children of Jacob, which are later referred to as the children of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali. There's one daughter, Dinah, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And these essentially comprise, they are the children of Israel. The only thing that will change in the big scheme of things is that Joseph, after he is sold into slavery and basically peddled to his dad, Jacob, as dead, will be in Egypt. I preached that message in prison for a purpose. He will give the words of interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. He will become the most powerful, second after Pharaoh, most powerful man. He's given a wife in Egypt, the daughter of a priest. That produces two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, who later on, when Jacob, who is Israel, discovers that Joseph is not dead, and all of that is unfolded, Jacob, who is Israel, adopts these two half-Egyptian children, Ephraim and Manasseh. Just before Jacob's death, he basically blesses all of the children. The chapter before that, he says, Ephraim and Manasseh are mine, essentially replacing some portion of the forfeited Reuben, Simeon, and Levite blessing, if you will. These are mine. So now you've got the whole, what encompasses all of the tribes of the children of Israel. I've just taken 5 minutes to describe and give background. Now, when people talk about the lost tribes, it's important to recognize that these people will go into the land of into the land of Egypt, rather, as free people. That is where Joseph was. That's where all the food was, because there was a famine in the land. And just as was foretold many generations earlier to Abram by God that these will go into Egypt, they will come out 4 generations later, richer, and not 4 generations of slavery, but they were enslaved whilst they were in Egypt. Now let me pause right there. Before they are enslaved, before there raises up a Pharaoh at the death of Joseph, who knew not Joseph, before that time, there will actually be an exodus before the Moses exodus. There will be an exodus out of Egypt, which I'm not going to discuss today. But I just want to put that somewhere as a pin. We talk about the Exodus, and people who don't have the depth of knowledge will say, of course, it's Moses that led the people out. But there was an Exodus prior to them being enslaved. There was an Exodus out of Egypt of a few of these people, not all. So just put that mentally aside somewhere. A future message will deal with those people. But now, back to the people who are in Egypt's bondage. They, of course, are led out by Moses, their deliverer, and because of their sinning, grumbling, complaining nature, they wandered for 40 years in the desert, what really should have taken them just perhaps, I don't know, or not maybe a month, I don't know, or 2 months at best, depending on how fast or how slow they walked, was 40 years of wandering all over the place, because God said, nope, right? But in the process, we have a man who is raised up in that group, Joshua. And after Moses and Aaron leading the people, Aaron being Moses' brother, and Aaron committing the terrible sin of building the golden calf while Moses was up on the mount, and Moses committing the terrible sin of striking the rock a second time when God said, speak to the rock for water to come forth. Let's just say that both of these men did not get across the line into the land, but God raised up one, Joshua, to take the people into the promised land. And the book of Joshua picks up and tells of the people entering into that land, how they had to go in and conquer the land. The land was not free of pesteous people. God said, go in and kick the shellacker out of those people. Go in and claim your land. Now, just stop right there for just 1 second and think about it. Anytime that there is a promise of God in the book, Why do we think, well, yeah, of course, there's no labor in it at all. You know, we read it, and there's no laboring to enter into that and wrestling to claim something, but that's the way God does something. He says, this is yours, but you got to pray it out. You got to claim it out. You got to work it out. I'm not talking about works, but I'm talking about just like these people did. There were enemies in the land. Go claim your territories, but you're going to have to do some fighting for it. And the book of Joshua basically is all of the territories being meted out to the respective tribes, save Levi, who does not get land. And we have a record, more or less, at the death of Joshua, of essentially a gap of time where there is no one leader as Moses was leading the people, as Joshua led the people in. But we have a period called Judges. And the period of the Judges begins the book of Judges. And if you read each one of these judges, you find that there is a judge representative of each tribe. In the book of Judges, there's also a terrible story that I believe I taught on. I don't think it was a message here. I think it was a festival that I did regarding the rape and essentially the death of a concubine of a man from the tribe of Levi. And essentially the tribe of Benjamin was not cooperating in handing over the guilty parties, if you will. And it looks like at the beginning, this tribe of Benjamin starts wiping out and killing people because there's a clash. And then the tide turns, and suddenly, those very same people who are demanding the guilty parties be handed over start killing the tribe of Benjamin until the tribe of Benjamin, which was thousands in number, is now reduced down to 600 men. And there is a passage in the book of Judges, I believe it's in Judges 21, and it makes reference to the people are now concerned that essentially God forbid that this tribe should be wiped out and that Israel, Benjamin, should not have an inheritance. And if you want to interpret that prophetically, it's important. They recognized the necessity of these children and their descendants and the generations that ensued being perpetuated and preserving their tribes. Now, I want you to just kind of go, okay, that big deal. Well, it's a big deal when you count that the most famous person in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, and we're talking about after Jesus Christ, of course, Paul, in at least two different references, is talking about how he's a Benjamite, how he's of a certain tribe. Even down through the centuries, it was important to those people to maintain their identity for a purpose. This is why the genealogies, I've told you, I've done several messages out of the genealogies, where people are going, hey, you can do a message on genealogies? Yep, because it's real important. These people believed in preserving this information to give us the breadcrumbs to find our way back if we really want to look. So I go back a little bit and say, from the book of Judges, the passage I quoted, Judges 21:17, which is the question, should the tribe be eliminated of Benjamin? Because now they were reduced down to 600 men. God made a provision for them to take wives, essentially, and repopulate. And it's right in there. And the whole time, no matter, this speaks volumes about God's long suffering. The whole time, God is making provisions for people as they do evil. Because why? He knows our frame. He knows our ways are not his ways. So by the time you get to another famous Benjamite, by the way, who is the first king that God, by the way, did not say this is the one, but the people said, give us a king. They refused Samuel, and God said, well, they're really not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And Saul, in the Old Testament, becomes king, and a Benjamite. So it's kind of interesting. If you follow the tribes, you'll find that there is enough information to show God preserved things, and the references are there. Even the scant and the small things are there for a purpose. At the death of Saul, David is raised to the throne. He was God's chosen, by the way, which brings me back to that blessing we read in the book of Genesis that Jacob bestowed on Judah, for which David comes out of the tribe of Judah, the right to rule. So we've got now David on the throne. Now what's interesting about this is it was set on his heart to build God a house. And essentially, it's somewhat interesting, the response from God through the prophet to David. Really, do I need you to build me a house? Now, it will end up being Solomon who will build the temple, because we know that from the time, I'm jumping back now, from the time that the children of Israel came out of Egypt and the wandering in the wilderness, that God gave direction to Moses to build the tabernacle and all of the things that went inside of it, the Ark of the Covenant, table of showbread, all of these things, but specifically the ark where God's presence would descend. God says to David now, all these generations later, do you really think I need you to build me a house of cedar? Now, that's where I'm taking up right now in 2 Samuel, and we're going to start doing some page turning, so you'll have to keep up. 2 Samuel 7, because I've been reviewing all of these earlier things, so we're moving now into David's time. We won't be here very long. We'll be into Solomon in a minute. So 2 Samuel 7. It came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. And Nathan said to the king, Go, do what is in thine heart, for the Lord is with thee. And it came to pass that night, the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, Go tell my servant David, Thus saith the Lord, Shalt thou build me an house for to dwell in, whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. In all the places wherein I have walked with all the children of Israel spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, Why build ye not me a house of cedar? Now therefore, so shalt thou say unto my servant David, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I took thee from the sheepcote, from following sheep, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. And I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off all thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are in the earth. Here is the promise. Here is the thing I want you to zoom in on. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel. And remember, we're still talking about a united kingdom. The kingdoms have not divided yet. It's one big kingdom. North and south are one. And I should have said back there in the days of the judges, yeah, they were fighting, generations of fighting back and forth, north and south, petty tribes and squabbles, but it was still a united kingdom. Didn't have a king yet, but now under this king, united, one kingdom. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time. Now, we'll just stop with that for just a second. What's interesting there is the reference to the children of wickedness. I don't think that's just some generic, like all the people who are wicked, but the enemies that had been enemies from the beginning. Let's start with the ones that afflicted at the first. He's mentioning those children led out of Egypt, the children of Israel. So Egypt and its neighbors and the environs around, beginning there, shall no more afflict them. So you've got a promise right there, and then a further promise will be made at a later point, which I don't want to get into today. But there is a promise right there for my people Israel to plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own. Now, don't make the mistake right off the bat. Some have said, well, that's got to be Israel, present-day Israel. Before you follow this whole message through and find out that maybe the place that we're talking about, the place of their own, turns out to be some other place. Don't jump to conclusions on me now. Now, David is alive, but he will eventually die. And his son Solomon, who is his 10th son, will reign in his stead. And 1 Kings, I told you we'd do page turning. 1 Kings 11, I've told you, David has reigned and died. We've got Solomon, and Solomon is reigning. But it says, beginning at verse 9 in the 11th chapter of 1 Kings, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice. And he commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he kept not that which the Lord commanded. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, forasmuch as this is done of thee, thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. I'm going to take it away from you. But notwithstanding in the days, I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Now, this is what's so interesting, because Solomon's son, Rehoboam, will come to power, and the kingdom will be essentially, all but one portion of it, will be taken out of his hand. And for the first time, after the death of Solomon, that is 930, approximately 930 BC, after the death of Solomon, and shortly after Rehoboam is reigning, the kingdoms will split, north and south. So Rehoboam comes to power at the death of Solomon. So if you read with me, 1 Kings, just a little bit further away, 11:43, last verse of the 11th chapter. Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. So now we've got Rehoboam. And Rehoboam essentially must hear the complaint of the people, because the people come and they say, "You've placed a heavy yoke on us of taxation for the building of the temple and other things." Even though it says that Solomon was blessed with wisdom, he certainly, I don't know if he was blessed with wives, but he was blessed with wealth. But they still had to impose taxes. So it's at the petition to Rehoboam to ease up on the taxes. And the counsel that is given to him of the elders says, ease up and don't be so hard. But the young men around him say, oh, don't back off, come on. Oh, stick it to him some more. And that brings on a revolt, essentially. And that's where we have the kingdoms dividing. Jeroboam, who is an Ephraimite. Now, I'm using terms now that I'm going to try and I'll explain now, but at some point I don't want to have to explain. That means he is from back there in the woodpile from the tribe of Ephraim. Remember, that's the one of the two half Egyptian children born to Joseph. Family generations passed down now. And it's still being preserved. So Jeroboam, if you were reading in 1 Kings 11 and verse 26, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephratite, which is actually an Ephraimite, the same word, same essence, from the tribe of Ephraim, is reigning. 10 tribes, northern kingdom. Rehoboam reigning in the south. Now, if you're not willing to keep these things separate, the rest of the Bible is going to be absolute nonsense. It's like people reading and they don't understand. There's going to be two separate lines of people reigning, two different chroniclings, two different histories of the north and the south, separate. House of Israel, house of Judah. Now, house of Israel, later on, and a few chapters from now, a few verses from now, I'll show you, will become called house of Israel will be known as well as Samaria, be known by other names, Ephraim as well. And those people from the southern kingdom, house of Judah, will be known as Jews. Now, I'm going to show you today, because some people are going to go, oh, you can't say that word. That's such a derogatory. No, that's the way they were called, because Judah and Jew, it's anglicized, if you will, Yehudahi, Jehudahites. There is no J, by the way, in Hebrew. It's, for those of you who read Hebrew, it's a Yod, Yeh. So they were from Judah, and the people that came from Judah or Yehuda were Yehudahites. That's how they were called. Now, in the pages in front of you, you've got the revolt of the northern tribes, beginning in the 12th chapter in verse 19. So Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. This rebellion produced the divided kingdoms. Now, if you're still not sure, and I just made the reference, I said to you, I'm leaving breadcrumbs big time for all of you hardheads and for people, yeah, I don't know about that. Because trust me, I've been around so many of those, I don't know about that people. They don't know because they haven't looked. I told you you're going to do a lot of page turning. So hold your page where you are right there in 1 Kings 12, but I want you to turn to 2 Kings 16. And verses 5 and 6, but specifically verse 6. Let's just read verse 6 so you can see how clear this is. First reference, 2 Kings 16:6. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria and drave the Jews from Elath. So here's the first place recorded where we have Jews in the Bible. Now, for the benefit of those people who haven't been here a long time, we're looking at the King James, a product of 1611, King's English. But the bulk of this, you'd be better off to look at the Hebrew if you could read Hebrew. And you'll read that where it says here the Jews from Elath, the Hebrew reads Yehudahi. So we're still talking about those people from the southern kingdom. I want to make that abundantly clear, and you must separate these people. Why? The importance here is if a person fails to make the distinction between those people of the north and those people of the south, you'll end up with what I watched as a program on TV where there was no separate groups of people. They were considered one group, deported in the Babylonian days, and that's just fraught with error, because now you're grouping two separate and distinct, which the Bible will keep. They will keep them separate and distinct, by the way, straight until the end. So as long as you keep the house of Judah and the house of Israel separated in your mind, at some point, the prophet Ezekiel will talk about these two different houses represented by two sticks, and tells the prophet, take the two sticks and put the two sticks in one hand, representing a future time that has not yet happened. And this is why I told you, if you don't get these things straight as a foundation, you're going to be so confused. You know, I started studying the Bible listening to Dr. Scott, and it made no sense to me. I couldn't figure out, I'm admitting to you, I mean, this is 20 years ago. It made no sense to me why the records of Kings and Chronicles, you know, one says this and one says that, but they have crossovers of names that are similar and, familiar. Well, because I then didn't understand the separation between the north and the south, and one is a chronicle, one is a record of the northern, and one is a record of the southern. Without making that distinction, you're going to be confused. What am I reading? So, I just did that for the sake of people who are hardheads like me. Okay? All right. Because I believe we all have to start somewhere, by the way, and the journey is complicated enough. So forgive me for the simplicity here of explaining this. All right, back in 1 Kings So we have Jeroboam, who is reigning. He's got the northern kingdom. He dies in 909 BC, approximately. His son Nadab will reign for 2 years. Nadab will be assassinated by Baasha. We looked at him from the tribe of Issachar. Nice, right? And what happens there, kind of interesting. Baasha kills 1 Kings, told you you're moving along here. We're going to make it through the Bible today. 1 Kings 15. Baasha kills Nadab, and now Baasha is ruling. And there's something really important in 1 Kings 15 about Baasha. It says that he reigned over all of Israel in Tirzah 20 and 4 years. So Baasha established the capital of the north in Tirzah. That will not last long, by the way. Baasha's son Elah will rule. That's the next chapter over. Elah will rule for 2 years. And you're saying, what does this have to do with the lost tribes? Well, just remember, everybody knows where, all the people know where they come from, their lineage. So you've got the son, Elah, murdered by a man named Zimri. And Zimri will rule. If you want to read in 1 Kings 16, it says, Zimri went in and smote him, referring to Elah, killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his stead. Came to pass when he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he slew all the house of Baasha. He left him not one that pisseth against the wall. It's King James for you. Neither of his kinsfolks, nor of his friends. Thus did Zimri destroy all the house of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. And for all the sins of Baasha, and the sins of Elah his son, by which they sinned, and by which they made Israel to sin, in provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities. Now Zimri rules, but Zimri is going to essentially commit suicide. And you read about that in verse 18. Came to pass when Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the palace of the king's house, burnt the king's house over him with fire, and died. Committed suicide. Now this is what's important. Remember, up until this point, Tirzah was the capital, the palace was there, that was the epicenter of the northern kingdom. Now, at the death of Zimri, there's going to be a bifurcation of the people within the northern tribe temporarily. Some of the people begin to follow a man named Tibni, the son of Ginath, and others followed Omri. And verse 22 says, but the people that followed Omri prevailed against the people that followed Tibni, the son of Ginath. So Tibni died and Omri reigned. And what is important about this? Verse 24, he bought the hill Samaria of Shemer for 2 talents of silver, built on the hill, called the name of the city which he built after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill, Samaria. So from this time forward, the capital of the northern kingdom will be Samaria. And sometimes when you're reading scripture, it will refer, as if we all assume, it will refer to Samaria. It's referring at times to what we're describing right here, but also the people that live there, like we talk about Israel and the house of Israel, or Judah and the house of Judah. Samaria becomes important. Furthermore, what will be relevant, although there will be several secular references to Omri, in a short span of time, the references after, we'll call it maybe about 50 or 60 years, the references, secular references, will no longer be referring to the house of Israel as the house of Israel, but they'll be referring to the house of Omri. And that's what you've got to kind of get in your mind if you're going to begin to study this, because there's all these morphings that are happening, but it's going to be the same people known by a different name. And somewhere down the line, the Assyrians will chronicle this. In fact, there are many different artifacts that one can research that show references to people. We can line up the Bible and the people and show how this lines up. Anyway, what is interesting is those people, I'm referring to the Assyrians, will call these people that I'm referring to in the northern portion, some of the northern portion, Beit Omri. And I'm just making that generic. There is, if you want to do your own research, the British Museum has a beautiful 9th century, authentically real, beautiful Moabite stone. It's done by the king of Moab, Mesha, which mentions Omri, king of Israel, that oppressed Moab many days but subsequently lost. There is still a reference there to Omri in relation to Israel, but that will suddenly die out and it'll become people of the north referred to as the house Beit Omri. And why is that important? I'm going to try and put this out there, and this is something I'll have to come back and review. Because later on, we're going to find people being deported and moved around by the Assyrians as time moves on. First with Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser. There's several successive waves of deportation that will happen to these people who are house of Israel in part, house of Omri, and as they move, remember, we're talking about languages that will have different sounds and different intonations and different ways of writing. For certain, that will change our understanding, but the people known as the house of Omri will begin to be known by names as the people of the land of Gamir, which is Omri. It's the same Hebrew letter. We just have different ways, for example, from Hebrew to Arabic to the different tongues of pronouncing what Hebrew is ayin, which is a h. It's not a h, but it's a h. It's kind of a gross sound. But what is important is that these people will be referred to as people from the land of Gamir, the Jamira, and we'll trace these people as we begin to see. You say, well, how is Omri and Jamira or Jamir related? Well, the Assyrians did a weird thing. They would always, many times, flip the last letters. So Omri, R-I, Gamir, I-R. They would flip the last sounds and reverse them. So you're going to follow a thread of people who, the northern people, and not all of them, but the bulk of them, are going to be moved in successive waves. And as they begin to be moved, they are not moved in the same way that the later people of the south who are brought into Babylonian captivity, they're not moved the same way. These people who are moved to the north are moved and settled essentially in two different places, and we know that they had independence at that time. They were not like the people in Babylon who couldn't leave, couldn't go. These people who were the northern portion that were moved by the Assyrians had great freedom. If you read the apocryphal book of Tobit, it describes much of what I'm saying in a few verses that talks about how one individual was moving about, free people, all right? So it's important. This is a marker in trying to locate people whose names will change, by the way, and that if you are going to navigate down the pipeline, some of you will be familiar with literature on the what's called the Chimeroi or the Cimmerians. and those people who may be later referred to as the Celts. And these people will be all of the same branches of people that are migrating and moving. So as we begin to put down, as I'm putting down the breadcrumbs today, I want to make sure that it's understood there's a reason for tracing out these people. Now, I have to get myself back in line here because there's something that I need to tell you that's pretty important. And that is something that is said back in 1 Kings 14. 1 Kings 14, 15. For the Lord shall smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and he shall root up Israel out of this good land, which he gave to their fathers, and will scatter them beyond the river, because they have made their groves provoking the Lord to anger. Now I want you to focus on that right there. They're going to be scattered beyond the river. And the reference of beyond the river is always referring to, in this case, beyond the Euphrates. There'll be scattered people beyond the Euphrates River. Now, if you're ready, we'll just read a few of the opening verses of the book of Hosea. Hosea is interesting because he's one of the important guys that a lot of preachers don't want to preach on, because it opens up with the word of the Lord telling the prophet to go marry a whore. I mean, it's in the Bible, don't be afraid. It's God saying, and it's representative of something, of his people. And 3 children, the Lord said unto him, Hosea 1 and verse 4, call his name Jezreel. What did I just read to you in 1 Kings 14 about scattered beyond the river? Call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, Jezreel means scattered or sown of God. Now, just think about that, because back there in 1 Kings, scattered beyond the river, here, first kid, call Jezreel. Second child, call her name Lo Rama. Lo, negative, mercy. For I will have no mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. And then the third one, call his name Lo Ami, not Ami, people. For ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. And you could tell God's kind of ticked off at this point. But then read carefully the grace of God in verse 10. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, ye are the sons of the living God. Now, why is that important? Because even there, with such an ominous prediction upon the names of 3 children, God is saying, one shall be scattered, one shall be no mercy, one shall be not my people. But in the place where this has been declared, they'll be known as the sons of the living God, which is echoing far into the future of something that God is yet to do, which is why I said you can't navigate the Bible without having some of these crazy pegs or breadcrumbs, as I'm calling them, put in place. Now, the beginning of the scattering starts in 745 with, as I mentioned, Tiglath-Pileser becoming the king of Assyria, moving hundreds of the, which will become scattered ones, who in the Bible is known as Pul, P-U-L, 2 Kings 15:20, beginning at verse 19, because it'll make the reference to Pul, who, if you want to put a note there, that is Tiglath-Pileser. Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. And Menahem exacted the money of Israel, even of all the mighty men of wealth, each man 50 shekels of silver, to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and stayed not there in the land. So it's kind of interesting, because this man reigns, Menahem, dies. His son will reign for 2 years. Then you've got Ahaz, And the reference in 2 Kings 16:7, another king is reigning. Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. So now we have this picture, if you will. And I began with Tiglath-Pileser because we really can historically begin to put the pegs down, both with the Bible and with the historical records. Somebody might ask, what historical records? Well, if you're into archaeology, there are abundant things to look at, from cylinders and prisms, which give us the stels, Kirk stele, as I referenced, the Moabite stone. But there are other things as well. The cache of, I believe it's over 23,000 cuneiform tablets found by Layard, which at least for the most part give us some good insight. So there are enough pieces here, plus, as I said, the secular records, the records of the Assyrians, which always, by the way, they'd never lost a battle. But we begin to see a large portion of people being carried off. Now, if you've got a Bible like mine, you don't have to turn the page. I've just given you the passages of referencing Tiglath-Pileser, but just a few verses back into the end of the 15th chapter, verse 29, in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon and Abel-Beth-Maach and Jaonah and Kadesh and Hazor and Gilead and Galilee and the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. And if you want the rest of the band that was carried off, you would read, just make a note somewhere, 1 Chronicles 5 and 26, which also chronicles other people being carried off. Now, what is so interesting about this is that we begin to see people are being moved, and we're talking about the people of the north. One of the things that's sometimes left out is there was a deportation, interestingly enough. I don't know if it's an accident or what. Remember, the southern kingdom will not be carried away until much later. But there is a portion of Jehudites, of Judeans, or people of Judah, rather, who will be carried off. And they too, for some reason they're never mentioned, they too will be moved with those moving north. Now, here's where I'm going to try and put some pieces down I think that are important. One of them is that there must have been at least 2 or 3 different groups of people moved and settled. And I think with the final wave of people, maybe with Shalmaneser or one of the later kings, bringing a whole host of people and depositing them, migrations begin to move even further. And there is a record in the Apocrypha, and I will read it to you briefly, from the vision that is given to Ezra, which in the Apocrypha is 2nd Esdras, where it's kind of interesting. He sees a great crowd of people, and what the vision is being described to him, and he says, these are the 10 tribes of Israel who were taken away into captivity in the time of King Hoshea. King Shalmaneser of Assyria captured them and deported them to a foreign land east of the Euphrates River. But the 10 tribes decided not to stay in that land among many Gentiles. I'm reading today's English version, so forgive me. So they moved farther east to a country where no human beings had ever lived before. Now, remember I said there was a portion of people taken that were part of the southern batch. I just referenced that in passing for some reason, because here it says, there they hope to keep their laws. Well, by the time the people, the bulk of the north, had been moved, much of the law and laws had already been abandoned. And this is why it's important to take the reference of the few that might have been moved that were still practicing what would have been going on in the southern kingdom in the epicenter, even though it was perverted and it was far off from the original intent, they were still perhaps practicing some things. That is the reference here. There they'd hoped to keep their laws, which they'd failed to keep in their own country. When they had to make the difficult passage across the Euphrates, God Most High performed miracles for them and blocked the channels of the river until they'd crossed over. For their long journey through that region, which is named Azareth, or Azareth, there's a reference in the King James to Asareth, took a year and a half, and they lived there ever since. And then it goes on to something that's a prophecy of a future time of the return of Christ. So it's somewhat interesting that if one is willing to look, we see that we cannot homogenize the people of the north and the people of the south. Now, some people were moved into what the Bible is going to refer to as the land of the Medes. And there are even territories given that spell out in the approximate area. And as we begin to trace Bible and archaeology, we find out that these people are not lost. They were never lost. And that if we begin to pay close attention, the people that were of the south who are carried off into captivity, into Babylonian captivity, and we know that there's a portion of those people who will stay in Babylon, and the small amount, the 50, 60,000 that return to rebuild Jerusalem, southern kingdom, and those that remain in the area of Babylon who will begin, they've made their life there 70 years to inhabit. Those were people of the south who begin to inhabit and stay there and not return back. But the people of the north begin a migration. And we can go to the secular records of Diodorus Siculus and Strabo and others who chronicle people who will encounter them, and their description and their customs and their methods fit the people of the land of Gomera. Remember, Gomer, tracing back to Omri, King Omri, people of Israel, who will then also, as I said, be referred to as the Cimmerians, the Cimmerioi, who later on the Greeks encounter and call these Keltoi, the Celts. And when we begin to trace, don't homogenize everything and say, well, what about this other tribe over here? Because I've yet to tell you about a few other tribes and their migrations, including the one I mentioned that happened, the Exodus before the Exodus, which will help us to understand a little bit about how people got to where they are and why when people say, well, what does it matter? Well, it matters because as time goes on, we no longer identify ourselves as part of a tribe, part of a clan. Our memory traces, just speak of America as a young country, we don't have that capacity. We may have the ability by DNA to trace back our ancestry and say the roots come from or the country of origin or something, but we no longer know our tribal origins. But these people kept the book and kept the record for a reason. And as we move towards the prophetic, it becomes important to understand the references and the words that are given, for example, in the book of Daniel, to thy people and upon thy people, referencing where Daniel was from and the place he was living with the people he was living, versus other peoples who have been scattered, and the two people are not the same. They may come from Father Jacob, who was very busy, but these people to the north ended up in buffer zones or buffer states. And why it's important to separate them, and I'm not going to go into detail beyond this. Why it's important to separate this is because we'll begin to see a spin-off of other people who will appear, whom the prophet Amos will refer to in a promise that he gives regarding the house of Isaac. And some of these people who have been moved off that way, like Dallas Raines, moved off that way, will be in one of those buffer zones referred to as the Eskuza or the Sakai or the Sakasuni. And although there are people that were moved, They resided in different places at different times, in similar time frame, but will migrate into different areas. And these people are the people that will pop up in other places. So when people talk about the origins of something and want to tell you about the Jews, and I hear this and it drives me crazy because it's homogenized as if everything is one big lump sum. It's not. House of Israel and the role that the house of Israel, the scattered people, versus the house of Judah and the Jews play in the last days are tied together, but never put them together as in this time, because that togetherness only happens after another set of events will occur, as I quoted Ezekiel and other passages that will line up the reintegration of two peoples becoming one. That is the lineup for the very end of time. We'll call it the last 7 years period, or seven years period on earth, that last portion of time recorded for us, giving us a picture of which peoples and which origins and which areas. When people begin to talk about how important is all of this to understand, extremely important. The mistake of homogenizing is costly. And when people talk about what part America plays a big part. Don't worry right now about how unstable we look, because it's only, cheer up, saints, it's only going to get worse. Don't look for the days of when England used to be a stable place, because those days, the erosion of the stability that we had even in the last 50 years past between America and Britain seems to be very shaky now, and nothing seems to be as it was, but that's the setting up, the stages, if you will, for the times that will come. But God is in control of all this. And if you could even possibly believe when people say, well, these people just disappeared, they wandered off somewhere yonder and they just disappeared. Explain to me how, at the very same place where these people disappeared, another group of people shows up with a very civilized, very perfected culture, language, and customs, not practicing the southern kingdom's worship, but with very precise ways and customs. A people just appears in a different place and tell me that it's an accident, when there are enough breadcrumbs through inscriptions, through archaeological artifacts, and through the Bible to say these are the people who have been labeled lost, and they are sure not lost, and God will one day call them out of the people, as the prophet said, in the place where I said this, to be the sons of the living God. We, the church, embody that in Christ in the now, but a time will come for that unification, which is not yet. I'm out of time, so if you want to hear the rest of this without too much review, or maybe no review at all, you got to be here next week. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.